Credentials issued by DMVs are extremely valuable. They prove a person's or vehicle's identity, demonstrate the ability to drive safely, and show ownership of vehicles. But for individuals wishing to commit a crime, they can be a golden ticket to riches or anonymity. In the wake of 9/11, DMVs find themselves on the front lines of national security and identity protection. The need to deter and detect fraud is greater than ever.
Fraud is a tremendous problem for the departments of motor vehicles. The credentials that the DMVs issue are in tremendous demand by those that wish to wreak havoc on other individuals, on society, and the DMVs need to be focused on fraud.
AMVA's Best Practices for the Deterrence and Detection of Fraud is a resource for jurisdictions to use in the fight against fraud. The document gives background on different types of fraud and the psychology of those who seek to perpetrate fraud. It also discusses the impact fraud can have on national security and highway safety, as well as the personal impact identity theft can have on the customers DMVs serve.
The document was created to help jurisdictions deal with the changing faces of fraud. What it does is it provides overviews on what different jurisdictions are doing, best practice for jurisdictions that are creating a fraud unit, that are expanding a fraud unit, that are maintaining a fraud unit, or that are dealing with new types of fraud.
The Best Practices Guide will contain everything from a matrix of countermeasures to training tips. It'll also include recommendations for having a fraud unit and what kind of activities those fraud units ought to engage in to, again, both detect and deter fraud from occurring.
The Best Practices document contains a vulnerabilities checklist on where fraud can occur in a DMV. The checklist provides both operational and technical solutions a jurisdiction can implement in the fight against fraud. The document also provides guidance on developing and right-sizing fraud units within DMVs to directly address the problem. With a sufficiently staffed and properly equipped fraud unit, the DMV will have watchguards keeping an eye on processes. The in-house unit can swiftly identify and address fraud problems and should have the authority to do so.
The document contains some really great information on how to beef up your fraud unit. It talks about how to justify a fraud unit if that's needed, how to build the fraud unit, why they need law enforcement credentials, and then some information on how they can help in areas other than fraud, reviewing legislation, for example, looking at policies and procedures to make sure that there are no gaps where fraud might occur.
Some jurisdictional DMVs have investigative units within them, some do not. Some DMVs have investigative units that have fully sworn officers. Some have investigative units that have only civilian employees. Civilian investigators play a very critical and important role in investigating fraud, but without the full powers of arrest, they cannot serve warrants, they cannot make arrests, they have to partner with local law enforcement. That's one of the things our document talks about is, regardless of the type of fraud unit a DMV may or may not have, is what measures you can take either independently or in partnership with law enforcement to conduct an investigation from beginning to end through arrest and prosecution.
It is very comprehensive, and it can be used all the way from the beginning to the end to establish that program that will help them become much stronger and be able to combat fraud. And so we've made it to where it can be used at all different levels for the DMVs depending upon where they're at with their own fraud fighting.
And not all fraud is done by the criminal element. The Best Practices document also discusses ways to fight internal fraud.
But we compare both internal and external fraud because we're fully aware that fraud that goes on internally has a huge impact externally. Simple things as an employee being paid off to issue a license to somebody who's not entitled to that license could result in potentially some very serious consequences, leading up to, for example, terrorism threats, where someone is able to get access to things and facilities where they would not have been able to had it not been for that employee helping that person commit that fraud.
Good audit and oversight needs to be in place for all employees at the DMV, as well as for third parties. Keeping an eye on employees is important, as many cannot resist the temptation to commit fraud if the circumstances are right. DMVs must be ever vigilant in the fight against crime. Criminals will constantly improve their efforts in the fraud arena, and DMVs must strive to keep one step ahead.
I hope they review the document and learn something from the best practices that other states are using. Some of the information that I saw for the first time really enhanced our ability to address fraud as well and gave us some new ideas and new strategies to try.
We all have a responsibility as a DMV to make sure that our efforts are as robust as they can to stop and deter fraud within our own jurisdiction because of the impact that it may have across the country. So we hope this external fraud document is seen as a very valuable tool to help an administrator and both that and DMV administrator assistance to help make those decisions when it comes to establishing a fraud unit or establishing processes and procedures to combating DMV fraud.